In this episode of Akram's Ideas, I'm going to share with you how to make this out-of-the-world baby quilt, so stay tuned! Welcome. I'm Akram Burris, and you're watching Akram's Ideas, bringing creative and crazy ideas to life. Before I get started, I just wanted to mention that I'm actually wearing one of my Buttrick 3286 tops. It is a vintage pattern, and I should have a blog post out there about this top and how I put it together and everything. It's a really simple top, and it's a vintage pattern from the 60s, I believe. So it counts as one of my vintage pledge patterns of the year. In this episode, actually, what I'm going to be sharing with you is a step-by-step tutorial about how I put together the out-of-this-world quilt that I made for my nephew, Grant. This is the first time that I've actually ever put together a quilt with individual patches. So it was a process, and it took a lot of hand sewing around the finishing of the quilt, which, as many of you know, I really hate hand sewing, but it was the only way to get the quilt to look as nice as it did on the ends. But overall, it turned out really nice, and I'm going to share with you how I made it. Our baby crib quilt was determined the overall final size of the quilt, and there are various quilt sizes. I went with a 30 by 40 inch quilt, which is kind of a baby crib quilt standard. Now that's approximately how big this quilt is going to be. I also kind of went with determining how big the quilt pieces were going to be, and as you can see here, I'll be using these three fabrics for the quilt. And the first one is this lovely little space fabric, which was the inspiration fabric for this quilt. And then the orange fabric, which was the contrast for it. And just two samples of fabric didn't really wasn't going to be as interesting as enough for the quilt, so I actually had some lime green fleece that I thought would not only add some contrasting color, but would also give some texture to the quilt and make it interesting. So after determining the size of the quilt and the fabric that we were going to be using, I cut the fabric into 5 by 5 inch square pieces. And as far as how much fabric I had, I probably had about half a yard, maybe a little less than half a yard of the space fabric, but about half a yard for each one of the contrasting fabrics. And I cut 5 by 5 inch squares for these pieces. To get started, first you want to mock up the layout of what you want your quilt to look like. So I just started taking the pieces. So here's piece 1, piece 2, piece 3, and then I would repeat. So I'd go back to the orange, back to the space one, and then again with the green, and I would keep repeating these until I got the overall size that I wanted. In total, I have about 12 on a single row to achieve our length. You can't see them all on screen because I can't zoom out far enough. Another factor to keep in mind was that when you repeat, let's say that this one here is our end piece, and so this is space, so I would need to go on to the next one, which would be green. And what I determined is that you would get weird layout. For example, if I went out and did green next here, while it would coordinate with the orange, notice that I get two space ones beside each other. So you can't basically wrap your design. You just want to start with the corner one as your base and then go from there. So if orange and then space and then green is the way we did this one, we'd start with the second one on the second route. So in this case, I started with the space and then the green and then space again, orange, space, and green. And you just keep repeating this. And like I said, I had a total of 12 pieces that went lengthwise. This actually went over that 40-inch length that I had set, but if I had taken one away, I would have been off a little bit. So it actually went to about 48. Keep in mind though, we're also going to have our seam allowances built in, so everything's going to shrink a little bit once you stitch these together. So once you have your layout, you might want to look at your pieces and make sure everything looks right. For example, on the pattern pieces here, some of the planets repeat. So here, for example, I've got a swirl, and I got a swirl here, and a swirl here. And in fact, here, this pattern piece is similar to this pattern piece. So maybe I don't want those so close together. Maybe I want to swap them out a little bit. Maybe I want this one here, and then this one here, and then maybe even on this one, instead of going sideways like that one is and this one, maybe I want to rotate it. So at this point, you want to take a look at your pieces and see where you can adjust if anything needs to be rotated or mixed up so that you have the best looking pattern that you can achieve or want for your quilt. Now ideally, once you've got all your little pieces and squares all laid out and planned, you're basically going to stack these in the order that you want them. So you're going to just stack them up, and you're going to take them over to the sewing machine, sewing them. In my case, I sewed these at a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Now I know that many quilt tutorials will have you sew at a 1/4-inch seam allowance. I did a 1/2-inch only just because to make it a little bit easier on myself, that I had a little bit more seam allowance. This is the first quilt that I've made, so I wanted to have a little bit more wiggle room to get it under the foot nicely and make sure that they lined up well. So here you can see that I've stitched each of the rows and see that I just stitched at a 1/2-inch seam allowance all the way for each one of these. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead, let me pull these pieces out of the... Now what we're going to do is we're going to press our seams, and there's different schools of thoughts with quilts. Some people say to press your seams all in the same direction, and some people say to press your seams open. And since I have a fairly large 1/2-inch seam, and because I'm using these felt pieces as well, I don't want to create extra bulk on one side than the other, so I am going to go ahead and press my seams open. I'm going to do that for every single square, and you're going to do that for each of the rows of quilt that you created. Now you can see that all the seams have been pressed open, and at this point what I like to do is sew them in groups of 2. So basically I'm going to match up my seams with and pin them together. You can see I've got one row here and one row here, and I'm matching up the seams and pinning them. And once you've got these all pinned, you're going to sew this seam here at a 1/2-inch seam allowance, just like we did the side seams of each box. So once I get this one row, then I'll add this row and then continue on from there. And I like to go, I found that it was easier to go one direction, and then when it gets too bulky is to start from the to start from the opposite direction so that you're not doing the entire quilt one way so that there's a lot of bulk in your sewing machine. This kind of distributes it out. So basically however many rows, like do half the rows going from one direction and then half the rows doing the other direction so it doesn't wad up in your sewing machine. Once you get all your rows sewn together, you'll find that they're a little bulky because, as you'll see on the back here, we still need to press open our row seams. And I've actually already pressed open the other end here, so you can kind of see what that looks like. So I've just pressed them over, overlapping the seams on top of the squares so that you kind of get this sort of encased box on each one of your quilt blocks on the back side. So everything is ironed and pressed very nicely down so you get everything evenly distributed. Now it's time to start putting our quilt together and work on the back. And typically, most quilts are made with a quilting cotton, and because cotton is a very thin fabric, you would normally want some quilt batting in between your back and your front. However, when I went through my stash, I actually found that I had some of this, it's almost a woolen blend. It's a little softer than a wool and a little thinner than a heavy wool, but it is, I think, a woolen blend of this navy blue. And I thought it would look really, really good as a contrast for a quilt. And since this is a woolen blend, I decided not to add the quilt batting just so that it wasn't too heavy of a blanket. It's the middle of summer right now. I wanted my nephew to be able to use the blanket right away, and I don't want to make it too heavy where it's just way too hot. So I'm actually going to omit the use of a quilt batting because this the back fabric is thicker than you would normally use for a quilt. What you're going to do is you're going to take your back fabric and you're going to take your quilt that you have and you're going to kind of line it up on here. And when we're going to stitch it together, your fabric might move ever so slightly. The rule of thumb here is not to cut your back fabric the same size as your quilt at the moment, because like I said, as you stitch, your fabric might shift a little bit, so you want to have some extra around the edge. I'm probably going to leave the back fabric about 2 inches all the way around, larger than the actual quilt block front, so that we can sew this together without worrying about the back stretching or not fitting the fabric. Alright, now that I've trimmed my back fabric, and like I said, I've got about 2 inches here that are extra so that we can make sure everything stretches and lays nicely. And now we're going to start pinning. And we're going to start actually in the center here. And I'm just going to put a pin in my square, and I'm going to, as I pin, I'm going to try to stretch the quilt out, making sure that it is laying flat and stretched to its maximum capacity. And I'm just going to go around and pin. As you can see here, it's another pin. And I'm going to go around and do a couple of different squares. Eventually, I'm going to go back and have all these squares pinned down just in the center point so that I've got them stretched and matching up with the back fabric. So as you can see, I've got my quilt pinned down in the center of every single spot here to hold it in place. And I said earlier that we cut the back about 2 inches wider than the quilt so that if we had some stretching, as we stretched and pinned it down, if it moved a little bit, we'd have that excess. And as you can see, we kind of did already. I had about a 2-inch extra, and now I only have about 1.5 inch extra because as we were pinning and laying it down and pulling, we actually pulled a little bit more than we accounted for. So that's why you have the extra here instead of cutting it to length. So I've got all my quilt blocks pinned down, and I'm basically just going to start from the edge here, and I'm going to stitch in the ditch. I'm going to stitch all the way down each one of these rows, going one row all the way down the next row, and I'm going to stitch these onto our back fabric. I'm going to be using a navy thread because that's what the color of my back fabric is, and with the so many different colors of the front here, that would be the most complementary and work with everything here. And I am going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from the edge here to set the edges into place as well. I'm going to do that all the way around. And like I said, I'm going to go ahead and stitch all those down. As we're stitching in our ditch, you can see that you're going to end up having a lot of fabric as you work your way toward the center columns. So you're going to want to start rolling your fabric a little bit in order to get it under the sewing machine arm here. Another thing that you can do to avoid so much bulk is to make it to the halfway mark of your quilt and then turn it around and stitch from the other direction. Now that we've got our quilt all stitched down, we're going to go ahead and use our scissors to trim away the excess of the backing, because remember, we made it a little bit larger just in case our fabric moved. So you will want to use trim that portion, and we're going to cut it right to the edge of our quilt so that the back piece and the front piece are now going to be the exact same size. Now it's time to add our quilt binding. For this project, I just chose to buy some blanket binding that you can get at your local fabric store. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and open it up, and I'm going to pin it along the long edges first. So I'm going to do one strip along this edge and one strip along the other long edge, pinning it into place, and of course trimming it at the end. And once I've got it, and I'm going to be pinning it to the front side of our quilt here. And once I've got this, I'm going to actually stitch it down at a 1/2 inch. So here you can see I've got my quilt binding, and I sewed it at a 1/2 inch on the long sides. And what I'm going to do is now sew it to the short side of my quilt here. But I'm not going to start at the edge of the quilt. Instead, I'm actually going to start at the edge of the other quilt binding. And again, stitching all the way down the side of the quilt so that it matches up with the edge of the quilt binding and not the edge of the quilt. Now you can see from the front here, I've actually got my binding sewn on, and we're looking at the back. And what we're going to do is basically, starting with this short edge, you'll notice there is a crease in our quilt binding where it was folded since we're using packaged quilt binding. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take that crease and use it as a marking point. So I'm going to take the edge and line it up with that crease, just like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn a second time, lining this up so that it matches up with our stitch line that we stitched the first line of binding to on the outside. And I'll just pin this into place like this. For this other corner, we're basically going to do the same thing. We're going to make sure we hold this first piece in place, bring it to the crease, line it up there. And of course you could also press this at this time, or you could just fold it again and bring it to the seam line, just like so. Once you've got your entire binding pinned, to finish our quilt, all we're going to need to do now is slip stitch the quilt binding to the back of the quilt. And there is the final results of the quilt. It came out super nice. It looks great in Grant's room. I made it just in time before Grant was born. He was actually born on June 26th, but I actually wanted some photos of him with the quilt. So he's about 2 months, a little over 2 months now. So I wanted to have him interacting with the quilt. He does love his quilt, as so does my niece Layla, which you can see here in this photo. They're both enjoying the quilt, relaxing in front of the TV or just hanging out together. Both of them are just two cutie pies, and I appreciate my sister at FateB on Instagram for allowing me to share those adorable photos and video of both Layla and Grant enjoying the quilt that I made them. I hope this tutorial was really helpful for you guys. I know that I'm no expert when it comes to making quilts, and this was quite an undertaking even though it was a relatively small quilt. It took a lot of time getting all the pieces put together, and I really admire you quilt makers out there because it felt like it took forever to make. But I did enjoy it, and I hope to make some more quilting projects in the future. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Akram's Ideas, and if you did, be sure to give us a big thumbs up. Don't forget to follow Akram's Ideas on social media and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching!